Hello ladies and gentlemen, Martin here, and yes, today is the day when we finally jump to Substance Painter and do some baking and texturing there. However, before we do that, let's just have a look at this quick time-lapse of me placing some meshes to create a bunch of burning sticks and coals on the bottom of the bowl. From Megascans, I actually got this free model of a rubble that you can download yourself and use as a base for the coals. I added the link into the description. All you need to get it is just to register and download the free sample. I also have these sticks here. I actually got these from my subscription to Blender Cloud, and they're from the Big Bug Bunny project. You have to pay subscription there to get these project files, but you should be doing it anyway to support Blender developers. So yeah, definitely check that site. It's full of useful project files and tutorials for Blender. But if you don't want to pay the subscription, you can download a free sticks pack from, for example, Turbo Squid, or you can even model these yourself, using the knowledge from this tutorial series. Maybe try it out, huh? Anyway, I positioned these assets so that it looks like something that might be burning at the bottom of the bowl. Also, don't forget to use just one material for these coals and branches. In my case, I created this sticks coal material. Each material you import into Substance Painter will work as a separate layer and will be then exported as a separate set of textures. So watch out for that. Generally, the more textures you use for an asset, the slower your render gets. Now go ahead, select all the parts of the mesh we want to texture. So without the wreaths, just the pedestal and the sticks and the coals, and then export it as OBJ with selection only activated. Once you do that, hide everything with H and unhide your sculpted parts. Select these sculpted parts, repeat the process, exporting selection only and naming it something like pedestal sculpt. And with that, we are ready to leave Blender for a while. Alright, now we are finally in algorithmic Substance Painter, where we are greeted with a fairly simple user interface. Let's not waste time with a boring introduction to what does which tab do. Instead, let's dive straight into it, and I think all will become obvious as we go. To start off, go up here and choose New Project. Here you don't have to change too much, depending on the detail you're aiming at. You can choose different texture resolution, but since my asset will be fairly close to camera, I will go with 4K. You can always downscale later. Now choose OpenGL normal map format, since that is what Blender is using. Then go ahead and find your exported model here. Be sure to import the base geometry now, not the sculpted one. Hit OK, and here we go. Our model is now inside of Substance Painter. However, immediately I can see one problem here, and that is this coal geometry going through the bowl. That, however, gives us an opportunity to show how easy it is to change our imported assets. You just go to Blender, correct the mistake, in this case the positioning of our mesh, and re-export. Then you go up here, click on Project Configuration, and here choose your model again. After the system updates, all should be fine now. There is also some mysterious third material in this texture set list on the right, and it's called None. Let's hide some layers here, and this None layer seems to be containing this peg here. Let's not worry about it though. We will simply not texture this one peg and then just duplicate the ones we already have on our pedestal matte layer. However, it's always best to check the list of your imported texture sets before you start texturing, whether it reflects the materials you created in Blender. If not, try to eliminate any unwanted materials from your Blender file, re-export and re-import through the project configuration dialog. Now, if you only see the 3D viewport after opening Substance Painter, you can simply hit F1 and a second window will pop up with your UVs visible. You can also enable the UV viewport by clicking on this icon up here. The way Substance Painter works is that you can work on your textures both in the 3D view on the left and also in the 2D view on the right. which is awesome. In the 3D viewport, you rotate by holding down Alt, holding down left mouse button and dragging your mouse. If you hold down middle mouse button, you pan over your scene. You can check the two texture sets based on the two materials we exported from Blender, and when you click between the pedestal matte and the sticks coal matte, you can see your UVs changing, showing us, ideally, the same layout that we created in Blender. Okay, now first thing we want to do here, before actually starting with the texturing process, is to bake our sculpted detail. Basically, we don't want to be using our insanely high poly sculpted models in our scenes, since these would be making rendering a nightmare. Instead, you want to transfer these sculpted details onto your base meshes by using normal maps. Texture maps responsible for the way light bends on the surface of your model. You can capture a lot of details by using those. So let's bake our first normal map. Select your pedestal matte here and go to this texture set settings tab here, where you will handle all your baking and baked maps. Here scroll down and click on Bake Mesh Maps. A baking dialog will pop up. Here there are several options you can check or uncheck. Different maps that allow Substance Painter to compute the automatic textures we will create later. However, we won't change much. We will actually just increase our baked texture resolution to 4K, and here in this high definition meshes add our sculpted OBJ. Once you then hit Bake Pedestal Matte Maps, you can watch the magic happen. Substance Painter takes the sculpted detail, projects it onto your base mesh, and bakes the detail into various texture maps that the system uses. And here we go, our detail is now present in the texture information. You can then repeat the process for our sticks coal material. Just be sure to remove this pedestal sculpted detail here, otherwise it would bake the sculpt onto the sticks and coals, which we don't want. Hit Bake Maps and wait a bit. And with that, we have all we need to start texturing the pedestal of our model. As opposed to its sister software Substance Designer, which is node-based, Painter actually works much like Photoshop, based on layers stacked onto each other with masking and even blending modes like we're used to from Adobe. You can find those layers here in the Layers window. If it's sitting somewhere else in your layout, don't worry, just like in Photoshop, you can just grab it and reposition it and it will stick anywhere you want it. I just like it here. The way we start texturing an asset is generally by using some basic material to put as a base. That will be sitting underneath everything, giving the material some basic properties like roughness, metalness, etc. These properties are based on the rules of physically based rendering materials. Algorithmic actually has a great short guide for this called PBR guide, so if you want to understand it more, definitely check it out, link is in the description. It's not really that important to us now though, so let's just choose a material for the base of our texture set. There is plenty of basic materials already inside of Substance Painter. You can also get many more here from the Substance Source platform. However, in our case, I have this statue stone material, which I included in the project files for this tutorial. You can get those on the Heroes of Bronze site. So just download your SPPR preset and drag and drop it into the Substance Painter shelf. And if you want it to be present for all your future projects, choose shelf. Or if you want it just for this project, then just choose the name of your project. Oh, and by the way, save your project. With that, type in statue stone into this filter window on your shelf and drop it into your layer window right here. Immediately we see our base color take effect. Now I have my own settings for this material we'll be creating, so just bear with me when we go through setting it up. To make the texture pattern smaller in scale, we can increase the repetition here. Let's give it something like 8, that seems good. Before anything, we can also set the opacity for the material, so let's just lower it to something like 50, so it's not that intense. Remember how I told you before that we can use automatic UV mapping because Substance is great at connecting scenes together? Well, first thing we can do is we can help that by using a triplanar projection, which projects the textures sometimes a bit more efficiently than Blender mapping algorithm. If you ever have problems with some texture stretching and seams, you can always try this option. But in our case, it isn't really necessary, so let's just stick with the UV projection we got from Blender. Now, before we go any further, let's create a group under which we'll put all our pedestal layers. Just hit Ctrl G to create this group, double click on it and call it statue. Why would I call it a statue? No, good, a pedestal, yeah. Mainly, it's important that you name it. How you name it is up to you, right? And now it's a great opportunity to create our first mask. As I've said, if you use Photoshop, you'll be right at home here because you just select your layer or your group, and here in this menu select add black or white map, in our case white. Now, since our material has two main parts, the pedestal and the bowl, we want Substance to stop texturing the bowl part with our stone material. You just activate this polygon fill tool here and define which color you want a certain polygon to be filled with. White is completely visible, black is completely transparent. So let's just slide the slider to 0 and click on our bowl. And we got rid of a portion of our texture based on the UV island that we laid out. To speed up the process, we can choose different fill selections. We can, for example, choose this object that fills the whole separate mesh. And here we are, with one click we disable texturing for the bowl by using a mask. And now we can focus on finishing the texture for the pedestal. We continue by adding a new fill layer to the layers window, which you can do right here. Generally, the first thing we want to set up when creating a new layer is which channels we want to influence with it. We have color, adjusting the color. Yeah. Then there's height, which allows you to generate displacement maps, roughness, defining the surface unevenness, then metalness, defining the reflectivity of the material, and finally normal map, which we already talked about. You can add more slots here, like opacity, but let's not worry about it right now. Instead, with this fill layer, let's deactivate everything except the color slot. Change the tone to some grayish yellow and make it dark. Now you can name it. This will be our dirt layer. Now let's go again to the mask pull down and this time set up a black mask. What we want to do here is to make the dirt only on some concrete spots where some sort of dirt would generally form. That we can do by either using a brush and painting it manually by adding a paint option here, then going to our 3D window and hitting X to making our masking color white, to paint opaque regions. Now when you start painting, your mask will propagate on the spots you paint. However, there is actually an easier solution, one why Substance Painter is so popular for. It's called Generator and it allows you to generate masks where different effects would take place. If you add it to your mask and go here, to the Generator Properties menu, hit the pull down and now you can choose between some different effects. You can also go through some presets here in the shelf, play around with various effects. It's real fun, so definitely try it out. For my material, I have some of the settings prepared for my previous projects, so let's create our own mask. For that, we will be using this general mask editor, and when we scroll down, we can define some textures that will adjust our effect. For the first one, let's go with Grunge Rust Fine, so find it in the filter. For the second one, you can go with Grunge Rough Dirty. Those are some of my favorite ones for this dirt effect. Already you can see that the effect is now affecting only the edges of our geometry, but let's work on it some more. Go up again and now set up some general balances between the two textures and how the different baked maps influence them. Set the global balance to something like 0.4 and then global contrast to something similar. The first texture's opacity can be about 0.5 and texture 2 fully opaque. Now continue with adding influence for the ambient occlusion map to 1 and maybe raise the curvature opacity as well. Well, that may be too much, but let's go with it now. We can always change it later. We can also add some contrast to our grunge dirt map to make it pop more, but that doesn't seem to do much. In the end, let's play with the blending mode, make it to overlay and lower the opacity to something like 80. Now let's make some general grunge layer, create a new fill layer and name it, for example, where. Set the color to a bit darker gray and also change the scale to 3 or so. Deactivate some slots, but since these damaged areas will slightly adjust the surface properties of the material, let's leave the roughness on and set it to something more rough, like 0.6. Now add our generator. We can again go with the mask editor, and before we start messing up with the settings, let's change the blending mode here to lower opacity and multiply mode. Now go back to the mask editor. First off, set our primary texture to grunge map 14 and the secondary to clouds 3. Then go ahead and adjust some parameters here, lower the contrast of the primary texture and set the same number to the secondary texture. Also, you can raise the balance on this primary one. Set global balance to 0.4 and the global contrast to 0.25, and then increase the opacity of both our textures as well as ambient occlusion opacity. Also, don't forget to set the curvature to 0.7. By the way, it will become much more apparent what we are generating here if we actually go back to the fill layer properties and set a darker color. See? But you don't want to go overboard with this effect, otherwise it will be too grungy. Now let's create another fill layer and make it this yellow color because we will use it for bleaching some spots of the geometry. Leave other slots at default and now go and set the blend mode to multiply with opacity around 50. We can change the color a bit here, more to orange. Make a new black mask, add generator to it, and again, mask editor. Don't forget to name your layer. Now for the first texture input, let's use grunge concrete dirty and actually leave the second slot empty. We don't need more variation here. Now let's just quickly set the global balance to 0.75, texture opacity to 1, make sure the texture to opacity is at 0, curvature opacity at 0.8. This created some random regions in the middle of our geometry where the yellowish color shows. Moving on to another layer, this time we'll be playing around with the edges some more. Make a new fill layer with a bit darker gray color and deactivate the other slots. Name it edges, since we'll be creating some edge grunge, and set it to overlay. Now add a mask builder and add this black and white spots 1 to the custom grunge 1 slot. Mask Builder is just a less fancy mask editor. Nowadays it's an outdated legacy tool, but I still sometimes use it since it allows some other settings like these levels to adjust the intensity of the effect, or grunge here that intensifies the grunge effect. You don't need to use it, but you can try it out, play around with the settings, and get to know it too. Maybe you'll even like it more than the mask editor. So now set the levels to something like 0.2, try planar blending contrast to 0.6, also raise the grunge to 0.6. Plus let's add some gradient from the top, so set it to 0.7. I know we are flying through these settings quite fast, but it would be for a whole course to explain them all, and instead I am focusing on showing you how this layered approach works, and later you can start experimenting with all these settings yourself, and also read a manual. Now I'm serious, the algorithmic documentation is actually not half bad. Make sure that the blend mode is set to overlay and lower the opacity for this layer to something like 80. Now instead of creating a whole new fill layer, let's actually just use an effect adjusting all the layers below. You can find it by typing gradient into this window here and dragging it above your edges layer. This will create a new layer, basically like an adjustment layer in Photoshop. Now select the gradient filter here and let's play with the settings. Let's quickly add some orange, brownish and ochre colors into the color slots here. Then you can decide whether you want to leave it affecting the whole material or again add a mask like we're doing here. So again, use mask editor, add grunge rough dirty to the first texture slot. Let's leave the second one empty. We don't need that much variation here. Set 0.9 to the global balance, 1 to the primary texture opacity, increase the ambient occlusion and curvature opacity. Now you can see that the effect takes place only on some spots and you can decide what you like more. Now for the last layer we will be creating, we can simply just select our gradient and duplicate it. Then start changing its properties. Let's rename it to dust, remove our old generators and create a new one, and choose our beloved mask editor here. Use grunge rough dirty and slightly increase its balance. Leave the other slots empty and then up here increase the global balance and set texture opacity to 1 as well as ambient occlusion and curvature opacity. By the way, we can add more than one generator to one mask. You just go into that pull down menu again and add one more. You can even change the layering order just by dragging the different generators around, just like in Photoshop. Now quickly set up one more mask editor. Add grunge map 8 and grunge rust fine. Blend in the two opacity sliders and also activate the ambient occlusion and curvature effect. This way we can combine two different generators together on one layer mask. And with that, we have created our first material inside of Substance Painter, tried out various ways to make masks, adding filters and adjusting properties of the layers. But now I encourage you to go back in and play around with the settings we were using, because this is the best way to get used to what different sliders are doing. And this is exactly what I did here. I went in, messed around with the sliders, blending modes, opacities, until I arrived at this result, which you can see in the final render. By the way, one small tip for previewing your geometry: when holding down Shift and dragging right mouse button, you can change the direction of the light. So, I hope you liked this part of the tutorial series, where we've delved into the Substance Painter for the first time. Definitely tune in next time when we create our next material, this time the metallic bowl at the top of our pedestal. And as always, if you watched this video, share it, comment on it, like or dislike, I'll be happy to hear from you anyway. So until next time, Martin out.